Thank you. I also feel privileged. Sanjay is presiding over this. I am the odd man out. I don't have visuals. I only have the audio. I hope this orality will have the magic of not requiring this. I also am an odd man out in another respect, which is that my professional allegiance is to philosophy, and largely philosophers tend to ignore facts. They only like conceptual connections. So this would be more about conceptual climate than actual factual climate. And this is about environmental ethics, which is a topic that figures in any philosophy course nowadays as one of the prominent topics. And it also has the novelty of connecting the notion of ethics to something which is outside humanity, I mean, literally speaking, because it is connecting ethics to the environment, not to the human subject as such. So it's a sort of extension of ethics beyond its traditional domain, the anthropocentric domain. I should take the problem of climate change as an excuse for getting off the ground in order to enter into a wider topic with which the thematic topic of the seminar has its specific place, even though the specificity of the place is overwhelmingly special in nature, in significance. The wider topic is, as I said, environmental ethics, or a moral philosophical understanding of the environment. Climate is, of course, a core reality of the environment, a ubiquitous property of the ecosphere. Although climate changes like any other phenomenon of nature, I mean changes within limits. Today the notion of climate change is no longer an innocuous expression. Today it is a change of nature which strikes us as most unnatural because of the fact that it is mostly artificially brought about by human agency, or what is called anthropogenic forcing. Being an outcome of human agency implies that there is a question of responsible agency, and responsibility is essentially a moral notion that puts to question the desirability or otherwise of the exercise of a particular kind of agency. Some of the many areas that climate change involves in regard to responsible human agency are intergenerational ethics, one, global justice, another, and humanity's relationship to nature, still. The first problem, intergenerational ethics, is that any action or inaction we take now on this problem has enormous implication for the living condition of the future generation. The second problem, global ethics, is the ethics of economics, insofar as distributed justice has to be done at a global level in regard to measures adopted for reduction of carbon emission level. The third one, humanity's relation to nature, is a more general problem that encompasses the other two. It is the more comprehensive and disciplinary problem of environmental ethics. Traditional Western ethics has largely been anthropocentric or human-centered, and it has been understandably so. There are two reasons for ethical anthropocentrism. One reason is that morality is a purely rational affair, or it is taken to be a purely rational affair. And only human beings are rational subjects who can comprehend the good and the right. These are the two pillars of ethics, the good and the right. The other reason is that only human beings are ends in themselves. and therefore bearers of intrinsic value. The second reason has two versions of anthropocentrism, strong and weak. Strong anthropocentrism is the view that only human beings are bearers of intrinsic value. Weak anthropocentrism assigns a significantly greater amount of intrinsic value to human beings than to any non-human beings or things, and thereby morally justifies the protection or promotion of human interests or well-being at the expense of non-human phenomena. This is true of Aristotle and Kant if we go back to history. I'm just skipping that part. Given the first of these two reasons, that is, the rationality, the reasoned rationality, there is no possibility to extend ethics to bring the non-human world of animals and the larger environment under its scope. Non-human beings of whatever sort have no moral standing at all, but does the second reason, namely ethical anthropocentrism in both weak and strong senses, also rule out any possibility of environmental ethics? One advocate of this possibility, known as enlightened or prudential anthropocentrism, is the view that whatever moral duties we have towards the environment are derived from our direct duties to its human inhabitants. Environmental ethics has therefore the practical purpose of providing moral grounds for social policies and aimed at protecting the Earth's environment and remedying environmental degradation for the sake of humanity. Thus, all the direct moral obligations we possess, including those we have with regard to the environment, are owed to our fellow human beings. Indeed, now that is one view. Indeed, the anthropocentric undertone of the many concerns we have regarding the environment is undeniable. All such concerns appear to be concerns precisely because of the way they affect human beings. For example, environmental pollution affects our health, diminishes longevity, resource depletion threatens our standards of living, climate change increases the risk of safe living for us, the reduction of biodiversity results in loss of potential medicines, which we require. Quite simply then, an anthropocentric ethics resonates with the clear pronouncement that we humans are morally obliged to respect the environment for the sake of human well-being and prosperity. Now, if we extend, what about making it animal-centric rather than anthropocentric? Riding on ethical anthropocentrism, we can argue that if I, for example, shoot a playful deer in a forest where I go hunting for pleasure, I do not commit a moral crime. However, many of us would hear the voice of our intuition about such an action as not being morally right at all. Killing an innocent deer or torturing an innocent cat just for fun or any other reason cannot be free from moral disapprobation. The whole thing strikes us as strongly immoral, notwithstanding the fact that it is a non-human animal. Now, what could be the basis of this moral intuition? The underlying basis of this intuition concerns placing a premium on a form of consciousness. Two thinkers, very eminent, Peter Singer and Tom Reagan, both at the moment in America, provide different but substantially similar reasons for their view. Alluding to the criterion of sentience, Peter Singer argues that the capacity for pleasure and pain is a sufficient reason for granting moral status to animals. And Tom Reagan's argument is that moral standing must be acknowledged in all subjects of a life. That is, being with experience, emotion, belief, desire, a sense of the future, and the ability to initiate action. Animal-centered environmental ethics is criticized, however, on the ground of its being narrowly individualistic. Our concern for the environment extends beyond merely worrying about individual creatures. And some of the implications of this view are plainly counterintuitive. For example, if we have obligation to alleviate the suffering of animals, does that mean that we must stop predator animals from killing their prey, or somehow protect prey animals from attack of their predators? What matters for environmental ethics proper is therefore argued to be concerned not for individual entities, animal or human, but holistic entities, such as species and ecosystems. So, we further extend it to life-centrism. Anthropocentrism, animal-centrism, now life-centrism. There is a natural reason to extend the scope of environmental ethics beyond individual animals to individual living organisms as well. Indeed, any individual possessing life, such as trees, ought to be considered to have a moral standing. Albert Schweitzer is so famous for his theory of reverence for life, which claims that all living things have a will to live, and that we humans ought not to interfere with this will. This idea finds a modernized version in Paul Taylor's claim that all living things are teleological centers of life. This means that living things have a good of their own that they strive towards, even though they are unaware of the teleological drive. And because living organisms have a good of their own, their life is intrinsically valuable. It is this intrinsic value that grants individual living organisms their moral status. The implication is that we must take the interests and needs of such entities into account while formulating our moral obligations. But then there is a criticism. Is being living a sufficient condition for the possession of moral standing? Certainly it is biologically good for plants to survive and flourish in their growth. But is it morally good for them? The more important question, therefore, is whether it is really good from the point of view of the plant itself. Do plants have a point of view the way we do? A point of view of their own, such that living well is defined from that point of view. There seems to be no reason to think that a plant lives its life for itself and views its life in terms of what is good or bad. If moral standing requires being alive, it must be life of a special kind that has a point of view and that can afford a point of view on the life in question. So, further extension to ecocentrism now. We are sort of extending it further and further into a more comprehensive direction. Environmental ethics takes a less individualistic turn when it focuses more on important ecological commitments to the interdependence of living things and to the harmony to be found in natural processes. What is more important, environmentally speaking, is the realization of our obligation to holistic entities such as species, biotic communities, and ecosystems. It is in this spirit of holistic environmental ethics that a very famous man called Aldo Leopold's land ethical deontological principle is pronounced. The deontological principle, which is a species moral principle, is this, Leopold Aldo's. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise, unquote. Leopold is referring to the moral standing of the land community itself, and then land community means land containing all its potentialities and the biosphere. Land community itself, which is a community consisting of various relations of soils, plants, and animals. Land is a fountain of energy that relies on a complex structure of relations between living things. We must preserve the relations within the land and avoid our violent and destructive interventions on it. Leopold's land ethic can thus be seen as an injunction to broaden our moral sentiments beyond self-interest and beyond humanity to include the whole biotic community. Once we recognize that morally relevant interests are not always confined to conscious experience, the door is open to the possibility of according interest to non-conscious entities and thereby and thereby their moral standing. Breathing oxygen is in the interest of dog or a cat, even though the dog or cat has no conscious desire for oxygen or no understanding of what oxygen is. That means something can have its own interest, even though that something is not aware of having that interest. Similarly, biotic species can have an interest in fulfilling their nature, even though they have no awareness of having that interest. Just as animals can flourish as living beings, so too can species and ecosystems that are good of their own and flourish through integrated functioning of their life process. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of this ethical extensionism is what is very famously known as deep ecology, which came into being, I think, in the late 70s, I suppose, in Norway, because of the persons of Ernie Nice. It may still be argued that extending moral standing from the conscious to the non-conscious domain is not sufficient to resolve the environmental crisis. What is needed is a broader philosophical perspective that implies fundamental change in our attitude to an understanding of reality. This involves re-examining our identity as human beings and our place in the natural world. Ethical extensionism remains too human-centered because it takes human beings as the paradigm claimants of moral standing and then extends outwards to include others that can be considered as having interests of their own. It is such a fundamental re-examination of our self-understanding and complete transcendence of ethical anthropocentrism that has resulted in what is known as deep ecology movement. This movement contrasts itself with shallow ecology counterpart, or the shallow ecology movement, which is anthropocentric in that its concern is that of pollution and resource depletion solely from the viewpoint of human self-interest, and all that we have been discussing would be dubbed as shallow ecology by the deep ecology. Rejecting anthropocentrism, deep ecology professes biospheric egalitarianism, or the view that all living beings are alike in having intrinsic value. It adopts a relational, total field image of the world, according to which organisms, human or otherwise, are best understood as knots in a biospherical net. One may wonder, however, whether the biospherical egalitarianism of deep ecology is any more than an extended social democratic version of utilitarianism, which counts human interests in the same calculation alongside the interests of all natural things. If this is so, then it can hardly be viewed as a fundamental re-examination of our self-understanding in the entire scheme of things. Furthermore, it is unclear how to make sense of the idea that oysters, for example, oysters or barnacles, termites or bacteria could have interests of any morally relevant sort at all. Without any proper account of such matters, biospherical egalitarianism is no more than an indeterminate principle in practical terms. The establishment of principles is quite important, especially when we have to deal with certain inevitable clash of interests. If humans have no right to reduce the richness and diversity of the natural world unless to meet vital needs, this would mean that we are under an obligation to protect nature's diversity and richness. If so, does this mean that we could cull non-native species such as rabbits when they damage the ecosystem? Surely such an action would conflict with the biospherical egalitarian principle that all human beings, including rabbits, have their values. All beings, including rabbits, have their inherent value. Thus, we seem to be left with no clear principles, or with only quite vague principles that can offer a real guide for practical action. So maybe we need to return to shallow ecology from deep ecology. We might already have sensed from this discussion that ethical extensionism taking us beyond anthropocentrism lends us in romantic idealism, and thereby inevitably leads us to confront situations of clash of interests where we are left with no clear principles for practical solution. One major problem is questioning how much we can get beyond anthropocentrism in formulating an environmental ethic that recognizes the urgency of policy implementation. Doesn't the acknowledgement of this applied ethical urgency of policy implementation indicate that there is a limit to how decentered environmental ethics can become in relation to its traditional human-centered ethics or human-centered character? The allegation of deep ecology that the fight against environmental pollution and resource depletion is entirely driven by human self-interest in health and development needs to be critically reviewed. It is certainly a shallow ecological movement in comparison to the promise of deep ecological altruism. But we need to examine whether there are non-negligible constraints on settling for this shallow movement and discounting deep ecology for being romantically idealistic. It is true that the relational worldview of total field image is a profoundly wise way of understanding our human place in nature. But it is also true that we would have to decenter ourselves from our locus in our moral humanity if that worldview of deep ecology is to be realized by us. Biospherical egalitarianism will inevitably cut into our constitutive beliefs and attitudes and emotions in such a drastic way that the normal picture of human agency would be unrecognizably transformed. Perhaps nothing could be better for us than this unrecognizable self-transformation of our humanity. If only it were a possibility we could measure in terms of probability. As our humanity stands, it is much too low a probability to be a foundation for any reasonable ethical theory. Environmental ethics cannot be a divine fantasy of the human soul, unfortunately afflicted in worldly self-interests. Our self-understanding as human beings in the world is no less a matter of understanding the fact of our moral humanity and its inherent limitations. Hence, we would do well to depict a modest picture of environmental ethics so that the modest conception allows for reasonable partiality in ethically relevant matters of adoption of policy. I'm coming to the last phase. As an instantiation of shallow ecological ethics, we may consider the case of climate change as it faces us with utmost gravity. Can we say that the gravity of this concern is no less for other creatures on Earth than it is for human beings? Certainly we can. And the risk of extinction or victimization due to a possible catastrophe for which we humans are more responsible than anything else is nearly equal for creatures of all species in the biosphere. And it may even make sense to say that we human beings, were we human beings to stop all modern developmental activities and return to the Stone Age, the Earth would presumably become a lot more hospitable space for all creatures. Climate restoration is what we ought to bring about, and that would require the supreme human sacrifice of our return to the Stone Age. Okay, I think I have exceeded time. All right. So I'm skipping something. All right. Now, so 1 or 2 minutes. Any formulation of environmental ethics or ethical environment would be highly provisional at best and realistically hopeless at worst, unless the foundational underpinning of such a theory is civilizational. The crisis of climate change seems to indicate in fairly clear terms that planet Earth is not meant to be an appropriate bearer. The planet Earth is not meant to be an appropriate bearer of the kind of industrial civilization that it now bears as a result of the Enlightenment rationalism of Western modernity. Science, technology, industry, democracy, human rights, freedom, preference satisfaction, maximizing benefits over costs that the economists talk about, consumerism, all these are outcomes of the Enlightenment worldview. And they are all seriously implicated as causes of the environmental crisis. So much so that the emerging ecological movement seems incompatible, both theoretically and practically, with the dominant spirit of Enlightenment ideology. Last paragraph. If Thomas Hobbes's social contract was the precursor of Enlightenment modernity and its techno-industrial cultural manifestation, then contemporary environmental ethical climate has to be created by a kind of natural contract as opposed to social contract, or in contrast to social contract. A natural contract that forges a new link between humanity and the earth along with its biosphere as its habitat. In contrast to the obviously anthropocentric terms of this social contract, the natural contract, the so-called natural contract, is set in eco-sensitive terms so that measures of human flourishing are well within the limits of planetary tolerance. In this new synergy between nature and culture, there might be hope for a civilization, and the burden of this civilization would not exceed the natural potentialities of Mother Earth. Thank you.